Why did Naaman come to the king of Israel? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Kings on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 8. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Kings chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given him victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper, and the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who was in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, "Thus and thus said the girl who was from the land of Israel." Then the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, "Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy." And it happened, when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me." So it was, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." In chapter 5, we turn to an event that we don't often see in the Old Testament, one that concerned a mighty man of valor in an army other than Israel. You see, the Old Testament is written from the perspective of God's people, Israel, and thus the mention of other nations and peoples are largely omitted. But this doesn't mean that God abandoned these peoples. In fact, when we get to our next study in Romans, we're going to find that it was these nations who abandoned God, and so God let them go. However, even that doesn't mean that God didn't raise up and tear down the leaders of foreign nations as he saw fit, even when it didn't directly involve his people Israel. In verse 1, we're introduced to a Syrian commander of the army by the name of Naaman. He is described as a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. Now let's unpack a few things for a moment. From later on in this chapter, we're going to find that this Syrian king is an idolater. So if this account was told from his perspective, I'm sure he would attribute Syria's victory to his God rather than Jehovah. But the writer of 2 Kings knows the truth and knows that it is Jehovah that brought Syria these victories. Now, over whom did God do this? Well, in some cases it seems to be Israel. However, that is not what is likely being referenced in verse 1. Instead, what is likely being referenced is the frequent attacks by the nation of Assyria, a growing power to Syria's north and east, and a nation that we should begin paying attention to, for this will be the nation that would later take Israel off into captivity. At this time, Shalmaneser II was king of Assyria and had been expanding Assyria's borders successfully in many instances. However, with Syria, his success was a little mixed. Now, yes, later in the days of Hazael and Jehu, we know from secular history that he would be successful in subduing Syria from time to time, but up until this point, he had largely been unsuccessful. And we find out that that is largely because of God. Why would God be protecting Syria? Because obviously he still had a purpose for Syria to accomplish, and thus wasn't ready to punish the idolatry that they were engaged in. What purpose God had will leave up to God, but this shows us that God rules in the affairs of men in the Old Testament, even among nations that were not his people. Now, who was the king of Syria at this time? Due to the fact that we have not been introduced to the next king of Syria yet, nor the death of the current king of Syria, and that we will still see him in 2 Kings 6, we have every reason to conclude that it is still the Ben-Hadad that we met at the end of 1 Kings. Coming back to Naaman now, even though he was a mighty commander, he did have a problem. He had leprosy. Now, there were lighter forms of leprosy that might not incapacitate him from military service or make him unfit to lead his army, but there was always a danger that this lighter form could develop into a more severe form of leprosy that could be much more of a threat to the health of Naaman. Now, had Naaman been subject to the law of Moses, even a lighter form of leprosy would have meant exclusion outside the city. But Naaman wasn't under the law of Moses as a Syrian, an important point for us to remember when we get to our study of Romans. During one of Syria's raids on Israel, though, they brought back captive a young girl who attended to Naaman's wife. She told her mistress that if only Naaman were with the prophet in Samaria, that he would be healed of his leprosy. This was the point of showing us the miracles of Elisha in chapter 4, to explain to us that the people of Israel knew that God was with Elisha. Naturally, this intrigued Naaman's wife, who told Naaman, who in turn told the king of Syria. Why did Naaman seek advice from the king? Because traveling to Israel on one's own as a commander of Syria's army could be viewed as an act of desertion or treason, and thus Naaman was correct in his actions here. The king of Syria thus gave permission for Naaman to go to Israel, for it was in his own best interest to have Naaman cleansed of his leprosy, if that was possible. He thus wrote a letter to the king of Israel and sent with Naaman 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing, so that he might convince the king of Israel to allow Naaman, the commander of Israel's enemy, to be healed. Now, in the letter that Ben-Hadad wrote, no mention is made of this prophet, instead telling the king that he sent Naaman to him, that the king would heal him. The king of Israel, who is almost certainly Jehoram here, was none too pleased when he read this letter, for he tore his clothes in disgust, knowing full well that he didn't have the power to heal Naaman. And when he failed to do so, he thought Ben-Hadad would use that as a pretext for war. But when word got back to Elisha about the king's actions, Elisha sent word to the king to send Naaman to him, so that he, meaning Naaman, would know that there is a prophet in Israel. We'll see what happens next, Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 9 to 19, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.